May 18th, 1565. The sun had not yet fully risen when Malta's sentinels spotted what was coming. It was not a fleet. It was the horizon itself that moved. 200 ships, 180, perhaps 200 galleys and support vessels cutting across the calm surface of the Mediterranean, carrying 40,000 soldiers, some estimates say 48,000, and the heaviest artillery those waters had ever seen in a single convoy. At the bow of each vessel, the crescent of the Ottoman Empire. Behind them, the conviction of a sultan who had taken Belgrade, Rhodes, Baghdad, Tripoli, and who was now arriving to settle an account that had been left open for more than 40 years. Malta's garrison had, at most, 6,000 men. That includes the Knights of St. John, the elite soldier monks commanding the defense, the Maltese militia, and a contingent of Spanish soldiers. 6,000, perhaps 9,000 if you count everyone who could wield any kind of weapon, against 40,000. By any general's reckoning of that era, that island was doomed. And yet, it did not fall. What happened between that May dawn and the day, 4 months later, when the Ottomans furled their sails and departed, with more than 25,000 of their dead on the beaches, in the ditches, on the ramparts, and in the calm waters of the harbor, was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was not the desperate heroism of men who simply refused to give up. It was a trap, built months in advance, calculated with the cold precision of a man who knew the Ottomans from the inside, literally from the inside, a man who had rowed in their galleys. But before we get to the trap, there is a decision, a single decision, made before the first shot was fired, that everyone who witnessed it considered collective suicide. A decision that sacrificed hundreds of men deliberately and in cold blood. And that, in the end, is the reason the Western Mediterranean remained beyond Ottoman reach. What does a man who spent a year chained to an Ottoman oar know about destroying an empire? That is exactly what this video answers. Stay with us. To understand why Malta mattered so much, you need to look at a map. Malta sits at the crossroads of everything. Between the North African coast and the southern tip of Sicily, there are only 93 kilometers of open sea. Between the Eastern Mediterranean, where Constantinople, the Levant, and the trade routes of the Orient lay, and the Western Mediterranean, where Spain, France, the Italian city-states, and the Atlantic lay. Any ship had to pass through the central Mediterranean corridor, and Malta sat exactly in that corridor, like a stone in the middle of a river. Controlling Malta meant controlling maritime traffic through the central Mediterranean. It meant being able to cut off Spanish reinforcements to southern Italy. It meant having a forward base from which to strike at the flanks of Christian Europe. For the Ottoman Empire, which by the early 1560s already controlled virtually the entire North African coast, the Middle East, Anatolia, and the Balkans, Malta was the last missing piece needed to complete Mediterranean dominance. With Malta, the western routes lay open. Without Malta, there was always that stone in the river. The problem was who was in Malta. The Knights of St. John were a religious military order that had existed since the Crusades. Originally founded as hospitallers, caregivers for pilgrims and the wounded in Jerusalem, they had over the centuries transformed into an elite military force with a specific purpose: to guard the Christian Mediterranean against Islamic expansion. For centuries they had operated from Rhodes, a strategically positioned island in the eastern Mediterranean, capturing Ottoman ships, disrupting supply routes, being a permanent pebble in the Sultan's shoe. In 1522, Suleiman the Magnificent had decided to remove that pebble once and for all. He launched a massive siege of Rhodes with forces that vastly outnumbered the defenders. The battle lasted months. In the end, the knights negotiated an honorable withdrawal. They would surrender the island, but could leave with their weapons, their banners, and their dignity intact. Suleiman agreed. Perhaps he thought the generosity would cost him little, that those landless men would scatter across the Mediterranean like any defeated army, losing cohesion and purpose. And he watched the knights board their ships and sail away. It was probably the greatest strategic mistake of his life. He would live 40 more years and never manage to undo that moment. For 8 years, The knights wandered without a fixed base, an order without land, an army without a fortress. In 1530, Emperor Charles V, recognizing that this order of professional warriors could serve as a useful buffer against Ottoman expansion in the central Mediterranean, offered Malta as a permanent home, on the condition that they also defend the island of Gozo and the port of Tripoli. It was an arid island, sparsely populated, hot, with few obvious natural resources. The knights accepted, and over the following 3 decades, they turned every inch of that rock into the most sophisticated defensive system in the Mediterranean. Walls, moats, watchtowers, fortified harbors. The island Charles V had granted as a quiet concession had become a permanent fortress at the heart of the inland sea. From Suleiman's point of view, that was unacceptable. The knights now operated from Malta as corsairs, capturing Ottoman and North African ships, disrupting maritime communication lines, posing a constant and growing threat to the empire's flow of resources. Every supply caravan departing from North Africa toward Constantinople risked encountering galleys bearing the Knight's Cross on the horizon. And beyond the strategic, there was the symbolic. Malta was a personal affront, proof that Suleiman's generosity at Rhodes had allowed a hostile force to reconstitute itself, reorganize, and flourish. The siege of 1565 was payback, a 43-year debt to be settled. And this was where the man who would ruin all those plans entered the picture. Jean de Valette was roughly 70 years old when the Sentinels spotted the fleet. 7 decades lived on the Mediterranean seas, in the Order's battles, in the political intrigues of European Christendom. He was the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, the Order's highest office, responsible for the defense of Malta and the lives of all under his command. In the Mediterranean wars of that century, La Valette was one of the most complete figures: naval commander, administrator, diplomat, and soldier, all at once. But there was something about La Valette that set him apart from any other defensive commander of his time. In 1541, he had been captured by the Ottomans, not merely captured, made a galley slave, chained to an oar, rowing to the beat of drums, watching the Ottoman Empire operate from the inside for roughly a year before being ransomed in a prisoner exchange. A Christian knight inside the Ottoman machine, learning how it thought, how it organized itself, what its tactical reflexes were, where the fissures lay between professional pride and strategic error, learning what patterns a professional military force followed when it encountered an obstacle, what moves an Ottoman general would make naturally, almost by instinct. When the Ottoman ships appeared on the horizon 24 years later, La Valette was not looking at an unknown enemy. He was looking at a machine he had operated from the inside. But to understand what he built against it, one must first understand what was coming. The force that arrived at Malta in May of 1565 was professional, experienced, and came with a clear plan. Mustafa Pasha commanded the land troops, a veteran of campaigns in Hungary, Persia, the Caucasus, a resume of decades of victories that any European general would have envied. Pile Pasha commanded the fleet, 200 ships, the logistical capacity to sustain a months-long siege in open sea, experience in amphibious operations across the eastern and central Mediterranean. Alongside them, the elite of the Ottoman army, janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, archers, artillerymen, military engineers specialized in siegecraft. The Ottoman Empire had not sent just any invasion force. It had sent the best it had. And then there was Dragut, Turgut Reis. The European world called him Dragut. If one had to choose a single name as the most dangerous of the entire expedition, it would be his. Corsair, admiral, strategic genius. Dragut had spent 5 decades learning the Mediterranean in the most brutal way possible. He had been captured himself, had rowed in Genoese galleys for 2 years, had been ransomed by Barbarossa, and returned to the sea more dangerous than before. He had taken fortresses, liberated cities, commanded fleets in campaigns stretching from the Turkish coast to the Canary Islands. In 1551, he had helped drive the very Knights of St. John from Tripoli. He knew the enemy he was facing. He knew Malta's harbors from previous expeditions. He knew the psychology of the Knights, how they thought, how they defended, where they were disciplined, and where they were too proud to yield. And, Most crucially for what was about to unfold, he knew the difference between a plan that looked solid on a map and a plan that accounted for what the defender would do to break it. The Ottoman plan was sequential and logically coherent. Fort St. Elmo stood at the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula, a tongue of land separating the Grand Harbor, the main port, capable of sheltering the entire fleet, from the harbor to the north. It was the first obstacle and the most obvious. While St. Elmo stood, the Ottoman fleet could not use the Grand Harbor as a secure operational base, sheltered from storms and surprise attacks. The Ottoman planners estimated that St. Elmo would fall within a matter of days, a week perhaps. A small fortress, exposed on three sides, with no defensive depth, no capacity to receive land reinforcements, under the heaviest artillery the Islamic world had ever concentrated on a single target. The logical sequence was as follows. St. Elmo falls, the fleet enters the Grand Harbor, the main assault on Birgu and Sanglea, the two central defensive positions of the Knights, separated by the inner harbor, begins with full naval support and secure supply lines. The campaign would end in weeks. The men would return home before winter. The central Mediterranean would belong to the Sultan. Dragut had a footnote to the plan. The internal harbor between Birgu and Sanglea was critical to the decisive phase of the siege. Once the Knights realized the fleet was coming, they would block access to that harbor with some kind of barrier. It was the obvious defense, the one any military engineer would set up. And when they blocked it, the response would be to drag boats overland, across the Sybaris Peninsula, into the internal harbor from above. It would be laborious, but perfectly feasible. With boats operating in the internal harbor, the water-facing walls of Birgu and Sanglea would be exposed to coordinated attacks alongside the land assault. The defense would collapse between two fires. Dragut expected that flanking maneuver to be necessary. It was the second phase of the plan, the one that would come after St. Elmo had fallen. But first, there was St. Elmo. And St. Elmo would fall in days. Jean de Valette had already thought through all of this. Fort St. Elmo was a death sentence written in stone. It sat exposed at the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula like a tooth that had not yet fallen, surrounded by water on three sides, with no land connection to the main defenses at Birgu. Any reinforcement had to cross the harbor by boat, at night, at the risk of being intercepted or sunk. During the day, no movement was possible that could not be seen and targeted from the Ottoman shore. When the Ottoman artillery turned toward that single point, concentrating its full firepower on a position with no defensive depth, no engineering could make up the difference. The conventional defensive answer was obvious to any staff officer of the time. Withdraw the garrison. Consolidate forces at Birgu and Sanglea, where the walls were stronger, where defensive depth was greater, where the supply line was shorter. Do not spend men on a position that could not be saved. La Valette made the opposite decision. Not only would St. Elmo be defended, it would be actively reinforced. Night after night, small boats left Birgu under cover of darkness and crossed the harbor, carrying fresh men into the fortress being reduced to rubble by the heaviest artillery in the Islamic world. The crossing was not safe. There were nights when boats never arrived, when men died in the water before reaching the walls they were meant to defend. But La Valette kept sending them. He kept the garrison rotation running, replacing exhausted fighters with rested ones, ensuring the defense did not collapse from lack of manpower, forcing the Ottomans to keep attacking, bombarding, spending days, ammunition, provisions, and above all, lives. The calculation La Valette was making was not about saving the fortress. There was no illusion about the fate of St. Elmo. The calculation was about time. The Spanish relief force was being organized. Garcia de Toledo, Viceroy of Sicily, had been informed of the situation and had promised reinforcements. But a relief army cannot be assembled and embarked overnight. It needed weeks, perhaps months, of organization, logistics, waiting for the right weather window. The safe sailing window in the central Mediterranean had seasonal limits, and every day the garrison of St. Elmo kept the Ottomans occupied was one more day the relief force had to complete its preparations. It was one fewer day that the defenders of Birgu and Sanglea would need to hold on alone. Fort St. Elmo was not being defended to survive. It was being deliberately spent as currency to buy the time the main defense needed. The men inside knew this. The letters reaching La Valette from the growing ruins of Saint Elmo grew progressively darker as the weeks passed. The walls were disappearing under the relentless bombardment, entire sections crumbling, moats choked with the rubble of the defenses themselves. The casualties were unsustainable. The fortress that had been designed for a garrison of a few hundred was absorbing attacks that killed dozens per day. The men who survived slept among the dead and returned to their posts at dawn because there was nothing left to do but return. The garrison asked to be withdrawn, not out of cowardice but because they could see with their own eyes that the fortress had no weeks left in it. La Valette received every letter and refused every request for withdrawal. He did not yield, because the arithmetic of war left no other path, because what was being built on the other side of the harbor would only work if Saint Elmo held long enough, if the Ottomans grew frustrated enough, confident enough, to do the one thing La Valette needed them to do. Because while Saint Elmo bled the Ottomans day after day, La Valette was building something, not in Saint Elmo, on the other side of the water, in Birgu, in Sanglea, something the Ottomans would seek out, find, and try to bypass. And in trying to bypass it, they would walk straight into a kill zone that had been prepared specifically for them. The first component La Valette ordered installed was the chain, stretched across the internal harbor between Birgu and Sanglea. A floating barrier of iron chains and interlocked logs blocked direct vessel access to the stretch of water between the two fortresses. It was the obvious defense, preventing the Ottoman fleet from positioning itself in the internal harbor and battering the water-facing walls while land troops attacked from the front. Any competent defensive commander would have ordered that barrier built. The chain was completely visible. You could see it from a distance. Any crew rowing in and glancing up before entering the inner harbor would spot the barrier. There was no disguising an iron chain stretched horizontally across the surface of the water. Any admiral approaching with boats and finding that barrier in his path would know immediately what to do. It was the same solution Dragut had anticipated weeks before landing in Malta. Drag the boats overland, across the Sybaris Peninsula, and launch them into the inner harbor from above, bypassing the obstacle by the only available route. Laborious, but technically straightforward. The Ottoman Empire had sufficient military engineering to execute that operation without difficulty. It had performed similar maneuvers in other theaters of operation, in other sieges of other harbors. La Valette was counting on exactly that. He was counting on it because the chain was not the defensive system. The chain was the bait. It existed to ensure that the Ottomans did precisely what La Valette needed them to do: drag their boats overland into the inner harbor, into the stretch of water that had been transformed into a kill zone before a single Ottoman boat had even come close. On the tip of Sanglea, camouflaged and concealed within the coastal topography, La Valette had positioned artillery batteries. Cannons of various calibers, arranged for maximum range and firing angle over the inner harbor, not aimed outward, toward the grand harbor where the main fleet lay at anchor, but inward, toward the exact stretch of water where boats that bypassed the chain and rode into the inner harbor would have to pass. Hidden before the siege began, before the first Ottoman ship appeared on the horizon, before any enemy eye could observe the defensive positions in enough detail to grasp what was there. And in Fort St. Angelo, on the opposite side, the main fortress, the heart of the entire defense, were the cannons that would complete the geometry of what La Valette had built. Picture a closed water corridor. One entrance, one exit, the same funnel. On the Sanglea side, hidden artillery aimed inward, toward the center of the corridor. On the St. Angelo side, along the opposite bank, cannons trained on that same central space. Any vessel rowing into that corridor would be, the instant it crossed the entrance, inside a field of fire attacking from two sides simultaneously. No cover, no dead angle, no escape except to row back through the same gauntlet of death it had come through. And to row back, it would have to pass through those same fields of fire. The chain was not the defense. The chain was the funnel that led the enemy into the kill zone. La Valette had thought through the enemy's obvious move. He had thought through what the enemy would do upon finding their obvious answer. And he had prepared the destruction for step 2 of the Ottoman plan, before step 1 had even been attempted. This was what a man who had rowed in the Sultan's galleys knew how to do. Understand the tactical reflexes of a professional military machine. Know that faced with a visible physical obstacle, a competent general would seek the logical alternative route and build the trap at the precise end of that alternative route. The trap was complete. It was waiting. But a trap only works if the enemy walks into it. And La Valette had no guarantee the Ottomans would do what he needed them to do. There was one variable no planning could control: whether there was someone on the other side capable of asking the right question. A man who looked at that chain and wondered, why are they so confident in a barrier anyone can bypass? What lies on the other side that they are so desperate to protect? Fort St. Elmo only needed to hold long enough for the Ottomans to grow furious enough to make the decision the trap had been built to induce. June 18th, 1565. The bombardment of Fort St. Elmo had become the rhythm of life for the entire expedition, a pulse of destruction that marked the days since the formal siege had begun. The Ottoman artillery pieces worked in shifts, knocking down meters of wall that the defenders tried to rebuild at night with whatever remained. It was a race between demolition and repair, and demolition was winning. Dragut was at the artillery positions, assessing the progress, making the adjustments that only a strategist of his experience could calibrate: angle, distance, caliber, placement of the guns to maximize the collapse of the sections still standing. And on that day, a shell fragment found him, a shard of cannon, or of a destroyed wall hurled by the impact, a piece of metal in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Dragut fell. He did not die immediately. He was carried back to the Ottoman camp, lived for several hours, perhaps an entire day, while the battle for St. Elmo continued without him. And then, the man who had spent 5 decades mastering the Mediterranean died in a campaign tent in Malta. At that moment, the expedition lost the only mind that could have seen what La Valette had built on the other side of the harbor. Mustafa Pasha was competent. The other commanders were veterans, but none of them was Dragut. None possessed the tactical instinct accumulated over decades of victories and defeats in the very same theater of war where the knights operated. It was Dragut who had anticipated the chain's placement. It was Dragut who could have, with the experience he carried, looked at that inner harbor and asked the question that needed to be asked. Why are the knights so confident about a barrier that anyone can bypass? Ottoman ballistics had removed that question from the equation days before Fort St. Elmo fell. On June 23, 1565, the fortress fell. 31 days. The fortress that Ottoman planners had expected to take in a matter of days had held out for 31, and the cost had been of proportions the expedition had not calculated. Estimates of Ottoman casualties in the siege of St. Elmo range between 6,000 and 8,000 men. 6,000 to 8,000 soldiers killed or permanently disabled to take a position that garrisoned, at its peak, between 500 and 600 defenders. Mustafa Pasha arrived at the ruins of what had been Fort St. Elmo. He looked at the smoldering crater, at the shattered stones, at the catastrophic cost of that single point of rock at the tip of a peninsula. According to the historical records of the campaign, he said something that was etched into memory. If this small daughter cost us so much, what will the mother cost us? The mother was Birgu. The mother was Sanglea. The mother was what was waiting on the other side of the harbor. La Valette responded to the fall of St. Elmo in the way that only a man forged by decades of Mediterranean warfare could respond. He ordered the execution of all Ottoman prisoners held in Birgu. He ordered their bodies decapitated. He ordered the cannons on the walls loaded with the heads and fired toward the Ottoman lines. Mustafa Pasha retaliated by crucifying the bodies of knights captured during the fall of St. Elmo and setting them adrift across the harbor toward Birgu. Crosses bearing the bodies of Christian warriors, a message that left no room for ambiguity. La Valette ordered the soldiers on the walls to keep working. The siege had entered its most brutal phase, and the most brutal phase was still to come. The Ottomans now turned their full attention to Birgu and Sanglea. The artillery batteries were repositioned. The ground troops closed in along the peninsula's landward side, and the admirals steered their boats toward the inner harbor to begin the amphibious coordination that had been planned since the start of the campaign. They found the chain, exactly as La Valette had foreseen, exactly as the trap required. The Ottoman engineers assessed the barrier, assessed the available options, and reached the conclusion that any competent military engineer would reach. The Sybaris Peninsula was available. St. Elmo was in ruins, no defenders remaining. The entire peninsula swept clean of resistance. The solution was to drag the boats overland. It was laborious. It was obvious. It was the logical path. The order was given. 70 boats, perhaps 80, were dragged overland. An operation that demanded engineering, manpower, pulleys, ropes, and days of work in the suffocating July heat of Malta. Soldiers not engaged in the land assault spent days moving vessels across solid ground along the Sybaris Peninsula, hauling them uphill and down into the harbor on the other side. It was a considerable logistical feat, and it took the time it took. And then, on July 15, 1565, the Ottoman flotilla rode into the inner harbor. The trap closed. The cannons hidden at Sanglea Point opened fire. The cannons of Fort St. Angelo answered simultaneously from the opposite side. Within minutes, the inner harbor had become a zone of systematic destruction. The Ottoman flotilla was caught between two fields of crossing fire, with no way out, no cover, no possibility of retreating without rowing back through the same corridor of death through which it had entered. Historical estimates place Ottoman casualties on that single day at approximately 3,000 men. 70 to 80 boats sunk or scattered. In one battle, in one day, the amphibious capacity of the largest expedition the Ottoman Empire had ever launched in the Mediterranean was destroyed. After July 15, 1565, the expedition was still in Malta, but the siege had changed in nature. What remained of the siege after that day was an army that was still physically present in Malta, but that, in strategic terms, had already lost. Mustafa Pasha was not the kind of commander who simply broke camp after a setback. He was a professional general who had fought difficult campaigns before, who had witnessed prolonged sieges, who knew that persistence sometimes broke what a direct blow could not. The attacks continued for weeks. There were moments when the assaults against the walls of Birgu came dangerously close to breaking through the defensive lines. Moments when the defenders fought with stones, with knives, with their own bodies in the narrow breaches torn open by artillery. La Valette, his 70 years weighing upon him, left his command room on at least one of the most critical occasions, took up a sword, and went personally to the walls. Not because the military situation demanded one more man in the breach, because the soldiers fighting around him needed to see the Grand Master there. And seeing him, they held. But the capacity to mount a decisive assault had been destroyed on July 15th. Each attack that followed was weaker than the last. Each retreat left fewer men for the next attempt. And as the days passed, the cumulative attrition of the campaign did what the walls no longer needed to do alone. Malta in July and August is merciless to any army that lacks adequate cover and regular supplies. Disease, dehydration, fevers that swept through entire companies in days, the progressive exhaustion of men who had fought for 3 months without real rest, without replenishment of provisions on the scale needed to keep a force of that size operational. The expedition had departed with the expectation of a swift siege. St. Elmo in days, Birgu in weeks, back to the Bosphorus before autumn. Now it was August. The Mediterranean winter was on the horizon. None of the main positions were in Ottoman hands, and the clock that La Valette had purchased with the lives of St. Elmo was about to run out in a way the Ottomans could not stop. And then, on September 7, 1565, the bill for St. Elmo came due. Garcia de Toledo, Viceroy of Sicily, landed at St. Paul's Bay with between 8,000 and 11,000 Spanish soldiers. Fresh troops, rested, supplied. Troops who existed there, at that moment, because 500 men inside Fort St. Elmo had held out 31 days that those troops had needed to organize. Every face in those ranks was, in some measure, that strategy would never dare name, paid for with a life that La Valette had refused to withdraw from St. Elmo. Mustafa Pasha looked at those fresh troops, looked at the state of his own men, and made the only decision a professional general could make at that moment. Between September 8th and 11th, 1565, the Ottoman forces embarked. The ships weighed anchor. The largest amphibious expedition the Ottoman Empire had ever launched in the Mediterranean turned its prows eastward and departed. They were gone. The final toll was devastating. Of the approximately 40,000 soldiers who had arrived in May, historical estimates place total casualties, killed in combat, killed by disease, permanently wounded, at 25,000, perhaps 30,000 men, 60%, perhaps 70% of the original force, destroyed in 4 months on a barren island in the central Mediterranean. These were not merely numbers. It was an entire generation of experienced soldiers and sailors, the men who carried the operational knowledge of Ottoman naval and land forces in the Mediterranean. Annihilated, not in an open field battle where unpredictable factors could be blamed, in a siege that had been meticulously designed to make the Ottoman machine spend its resources against itself, step by step, exactly as had been anticipated. The following year, in 1566, La Valette laid the first stone of a new city. Not an extension of the existing fortresses, a new city, planned from the ground up as an integrated defensive system. Streets designed for troop movement under siege conditions, walls calibrated for modern artillery, defensive positions integrated into the urban layout from the very beginning. The lessons of the siege had been absorbed into every design decision. Never again an exposed point without depth. Never again a position that an enemy could isolate and besiege without paying a price that would destroy him in the process. It was built on the very Sybaris Peninsula where Fort St. Elmo had stood, the same place where the Ottomans had spent 31 days and thousands of lives trying to force a passage. The city was named Valletta, in honor of the man who had conceived the defense, built the trap, and refused to abandon the garrison that made it work. Jean de Valette died in 1568, 2 years later, without seeing the city fully completed. But he saw it begin, and the name endured. The capital of Malta is still called Valletta, nearly 500 years later. The Siege of Malta of 1565 is the turning point of Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean. After 1565, the Ottoman Empire never again undertook a serious attempt to dominate the routes of the central Mediterranean. The defeat was not merely a lost battle. It was the signal that the frontier of what was possible for the empire had reached its limit in that direction. The crescent would not cross Malta. The lesson worth taking from this reaches beyond 1565. The innovation that broke the siege was not any single weapon or tactic, not the chain, not the hidden artillery, not the sacrifice of St. Elmo. It was the level of thinking that preceded each of those things. The chain only worked because La Valette had already built the destruction for the flanking maneuver that the chain would induce. The sacrifice of St. Elmo only worked because La Valette had calculated in advance that the time purchased would be precisely enough for the arrival of the Spanish force. Every piece fit because it had been designed to fit, not in response to what the enemy was doing, but in anticipation of what the enemy would do in response to what La Valette had done first. This is layered anticipatory defense, designing not for the enemy's obvious move, but for the counter-move the enemy will make when they encounter the obstacle you placed in their path. The bait is not weakness. It is the mechanism that forces the enemy to execute exactly the move for which you have already prepared the response. The smartest battle is not the one where you surprise the enemy with something they could never have imagined. It is the one where you understand the enemy so deeply that you know exactly what they will imagine. And you prepare the response before they ever get there. La Valette knew. And the Western Mediterranean never saw the Ottoman crescent cross Malta. If this kind of history is worth your time, share it, because these are the stories that the school curriculum never tells.